The draft came in low. It always did. Roice Halder had spent 3 winters in his cabin on the Niobrara Breaks, learning exactly where the cold entered, and it was never where a man expected. Not through the door. Not through the window frame he had chinked 4 times with moss and river clay. It came in along the floor, a thin, invisible current of outside air that slid under the base logs where the foundation stone met frozen ground and spread across the planking like spilled water. Silent, flat, relentless. He could track it by the way the dog moved. The animal would start the night near the stove, and by midnight, it had pressed itself against the south wall, chasing the last warm pocket in the room, while the cold current pushed everything else toward the corners. Roice had watched this happen every winter since he built the cabin, and he had spent those winters thinking about why it happened and what the correct solution was. The solution most men used was more fire. A bigger stove, a hotter burn, more wood split, more wood hauled, more wood fed into a firebox that gave its heat straight up the chimney pipe and out into the open Nebraska sky, while the draft along the floor kept coming regardless. Roice had run the arithmetic on this approach across 3 winters, and the arithmetic did not improve. More fire meant more draft. More draft meant more cold air pulled in through every gap to feed the combustion. The harder a man fought the cold with fire, the harder the cold pushed back through the floor. Yet he had learned this principle not from any book, but from a summer he spent at age 19 working a shaft mine on the Republican River Breaks, where the foreman, a Cornish miner named Pell, had taught the crew how underground air moved. Pell could trace an air current through a tunnel system by holding a wetted finger at a junction point and reading which way the evaporation pulled. He understood that air moved in systems, not in isolated gusts, and that you could not change one part of the system without changing all of it. Roice had not forgotten Pell. He had thought about him often on the cold nights on the Niobrara, lying awake listening to the stove tick and feeling the draft cross the floor toward his bunk. In September of 1881, he started digging. The trench ran 55 feet due south from his cabin foundation, at 4 feet deep, sloping very gently upward from the cabin end to the intake end, so that any moisture that condensed inside the pipe would drain outward rather than pool. He lined the bottom and sides with flat sandstone, pulled from the creek bank, dry-laid, tight-fitted. Then he set a series of fired clay pipe sections, end to end, along the channel, each one 8 inches across, joined with a mixture of tallow and wood ash that hardened to a near cement when it dried. The pipe ran from a screened intake hood at the south end through 55 feet of stable earth and emerged through the base of his cabin's north foundation wall, terminating at a simple wooden register set flush into the floor, planking 3 feet from the corner where his bunk sat, while his neighbor Duff Carver rode over on the 4th day of digging and sat his horse at the edge of the trench for a long time without speaking. Duff was not a man who held back opinion. He had built 2 cabins on the Niobrara Breaks and considered that sufficient authority on the subject of frontier construction. He looked at the trench. He looked at the pipe sections waiting on the ground. He looked at Roice standing in 4 feet of excavated Nebraska soil with a tallow brush in one hand. "You are piping air into your cabin," Duff said. "Through the ground first," Roice said. Duff shifted in the saddle. "Cold air. Cold when it enters the south end. The ground at this depth runs close to 50 degrees year-round. By the time the air reaches the cabin, it has given up most of its cold to the pipe walls." Roice set another clay section and pressed the joint with the tallow mix. "It arrives at the floor register warmer than outside air by 30 degrees or more on a hard night, and it arrives without force. No draft. Just a slow, steady supply that feeds the stove without pulling cold in through the baseboards. Duff looked at the trench for another long moment. "Roice," he said, "that is the strangest thing I have ever heard a man say about dirt." He rode back to his own cabin and told everyone at the Keya Paha trading post what Halder was building. By the end of the week, 3 more men had ridden out to look at the trench. None of them said anything encouraging. One of them laughed. Another one did not laugh, but had the face of a man who wanted to. That and the first hard freeze came 6 weeks later. The freeze arrived on a Sunday. Roice knew it was coming the same way he always knew. The Niobrara ran quiet the night before, which meant the surface was starting to skin over upstream, where the water moved slow through the sand breaks. By morning, the temperature had dropped to 11 below zero, and the sky was the particular shade of white that meant it was not going anywhere for several days. He lit the stove at first light with a single handful of dry cottonwood shavings and 4 split pieces of ash. He set the draft low, almost closed, and went back to his bunk for another hour while the fire caught and steadied. The floor register near the bunk was pulling a slow current of air upward from the buried pipe. He could feel it on the back of his hand when he held it over the wooden slats. Well, not warm by any comfortable measure, but not the 11 below that was pressing against the outside of his foundation logs either. Something in between. Something the stove could work with. He had not sealed the gaps along his base logs. That was the part Duff Carver did not know. The part none of the men from the Keya Paha trading post had thought to ask about. Roice had deliberately left the base of his north and west walls with minor gaps, not from poor construction, but from calculation. The buried pipe needed a pressure differential to pull air through its 55 feet of clay and sandstone. That differential came from the stove's draft, which drew air upward through the firebox and out the chimney pipe. With the floor register as the primary intake point and the base gap sealed tight, yet the stove would pull its combustion air from the register alone, drawing it up through the warm earth channel, rather than across the frozen floor from the baseboards. He had spent 3 winters watching the draft along his floor. Now he had redirected it. By mid-morning, the interior temperature had settled at 56 degrees, with the stove burning at low draw. Roice pulled on his coat and walked the half-mile to Duff Carver's cabin to return a draw knife he had borrowed in October. Duff answered the door in 2 wool shirts and a canvas vest over both. The air that came out of the cabin behind him was smoky and close, the particular indoor smell of a fire burning too hot in a space that could not breathe properly. Duff's stove was running full draw, the pipe glowing dull red 6 inches above the firebox collar. Yet the floor near the door where Roice stood was noticeably colder than the air at shoulder height. A 10-degree difference at least, the cold current running in along the baseboards to feed the hungry stove, while the heat stratified uselessly toward the ceiling. Duff took the draw knife and looked at Roice's face. "You are not cold," Duff said. It was an accusation more than an observation. 56 inside when I left," Roice said. "Stove running low." Duff said nothing. He looked past Roice at the gray sky and the bare cottonwoods along the Niobrara and the hard white ground between them. "How much wood this morning?" Duff said. 4 pieces to start. 2 more an hour ago." Duff had burned through a quarter cord since the previous evening. His stove demanded feeding every 90 minutes to hold the cabin at a temperature where his hands worked properly. He had woken twice in the night to feed it, and both times the far corner of the cabin near his water barrel had been sitting close to freezing, despite the fire running between feedings. He put on his coat and walked back with Roice without being asked. At the cabin, Duff stood over the floor register and held his palm above the wooden slats. The current was slow and steady. warmer than the room air by a margin he had not expected. He knelt and pressed his fingers against the clay pipe where it emerged through the foundation wall. The clay was cool, but not cold. Nothing like the 11 below, pressing against the outer logs 4 inches away. He stayed on his knees for a moment longer than necessary. "Well, the ground is doing the work," he said. "Most of it," Roice said. "The stove finishes what the ground starts. I am not heating 11 below air. I am heating 45-degree air. That is a different problem entirely." Duff stood up. He looked at the stove, its draft barely cracked, its pipe cool enough to touch a foot above the collar. He looked at the wood pile stacked along the east wall, still more than 3/4 full on the 4th day of a hard freeze. He pulled out the small notebook he kept in his breast pocket for tallying trap sets and turned to a blank page. "Pipe diameter," he said. "Give me the exact measurement." Roice told him. Duff wrote it down. Then he asked about depth, about the tallow and ash joint compound, but about the sandstone lining and the screen gauge on the intake hood, and the exact distance from the register to the firebox. He wrote everything in the small, careful numbers of a man who intended to use the information before spring. Outside, the temperature dropped to 17 below by late afternoon. The cottonwoods along the Niobrara cracked and popped in the cold, a sound like distant rifle shots carrying flat across the breaks. In the cabin, the stove ticked along at low draw, and the floor register breathed its slow, steady current upward, and the dog, for the first time in 3 winters, did not move from its spot near the bunk all night. It had found the warm pocket, and the warm pocket did not move. The freeze held for 9 days. By day 6, Duff Carver had burned through 2/3 of his winter wood supply. And he said nothing about this publicly, but Roice could see it in the way Duff moved when he came by on day 7. A careful economical quality to everything. The particular body language of a man doing arithmetic in his head that he did not like the result of. 2 other men from the Keya Paha settlement came to the cabin on day 7. One was a homesteader named Galt, who ran cattle on the flat ground north of the breaks. The other was a younger man named Pruitt, who had built his first cabin the previous summer and was finding out what that meant in a Nebraska January. They came separately and for the same reason. Their wood consumption was outrunning their supply, and the freeze showed no sign of breaking. Roice let both men examine the register and the foundation entry point. He traced the buried pipeline across the frozen ground outside, 55 feet of it, invisible under 4 feet of compacted Nebraska soil. He explained the depth, the slope, the joint compound, the screen gauge on the intake hood. He explained the pressure differential and why the stove pulled from the register rather than the baseboards once the base gaps were properly managed. He used plain language because the principle was plain. The ground below the frost line held a stable temperature regardless of what the air above it did. Air that traveled through that stable zone arrived at the cabin already moderated. The stove did not have to overcome the full gap between outside cold and indoor warmth. It only had to cover what the ground had not already handled. Galt listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set, the posture of a man who had already made up his mind, but was being polite about it. And then he pressed his palm over the register one more time and held it there, and his jaw loosened slightly. Pruitt did not say anything at all. He just looked at Roice's woodpile, still better than half full on day 7 of a hard freeze, and made a decision visible only in the way his shoulders dropped. He started digging his own trench on day 10, the morning after the freeze finally broke. The ground was iron hard, and the work was brutal, but he finished in 6 days using a heavy bar to break the frozen crust and a short-handled spade to clear the channel. Roice helped him set the pipe sections and mix the joint compound. The installation was not identical to Roice's. Prewitt's terrain ran differently, and his intake ended up 48 feet out rather than 55, which reduced the thermal exchange somewhat, but still produced air at the register measurably warmer than anything coming through his baseboards. Duff Carver waited until March to dig his own, when the ground softened enough to work without a breaking bar. He did not ask for help, but Roice came anyway and spent 2 days on the trench without being invited. Duff said nothing about this. He mixed the joint compound himself and set each pipe section with the careful fitted pressure of a man who intended the thing to last. By the following October, 4 pipe systems were working on the Niobrara Breaks. By the winter after that, 2 more. Each one slightly different from the last, each builder adapting the depth and length and intake placement to his own ground and his own foundation. The principle held across all of them: stable earth, a slow air, reduced draft, less wood consumed to hold the same interior temperature. Roice never kept a record of any of it. He was not a man who thought in terms of legacy or influence. He had a cold floor and a dog that moved around at night, and a Cornish foreman's voice in his memory, explaining how air moved through a tunnel system, and he had put those things together into 55 feet of clay pipe buried in Nebraska soil. The ground did the rest. If Roice's story pulled you in, hit the like button. It tells us to keep these stories coming. Subscribe to Wild West Survival Tales so you never miss the next character fighting to stay alive on the frontier. Drop a comment below. Would you have trusted 55 feet of buried clay pipe to stop the draft that had been killing your wood supply for 3 winters? Or would you have stacked more wood and kept feeding the stove every 90 minutes through the night like every other man on the Niobrara Breaks? Because on this channel, the next survivor is already waiting.